We're going to pick up with the State Farm commercial, like a good neighbor, right? Like a good neighbor.
State Farm is there.
State Farm is there. Which is, really the message is that they're going to be there for you if you pay your money, right? Like they're there if you pay them to be there. That's not necessarily a good neighbor. But it's important to think about good neighbors, especially nowadays. Anybody seen the housing market? Right? It's crazy. Do all of you have a lot of new neighbors? I have a lot of new neighbors. I'm surprised because I get very confused about the housing market. I would think with houses being as high as they are, yes, it's a seller's market, but I would think I would stop seeing people move into my neighborhood because it's too expensive, right? No, the exact opposite. People are buying up houses and there's a lot of new neighbors around. So it started making me think, like a good neighbor. What's a good neighbor? What's a good neighbor to you? I'm from the country, so I think I have a different definition of what a good neighbor is. Is a good neighbor somebody that's just quiet and you never hear from them? Is that a good neighbor? Could be. Like, is it somebody that's, that they don't cross over the property line? You don't know their name. They don't know your name. You never have any problems. Is that a good neighbor? Is a good neighbor somebody that respects you? Is a good neighbor somebody that you can borrow tools from, but they never borrow tools from you? Like, what in your mind is a good neighbor? Like, I have a lot of good neighbors, but I think of good neighbors differently. We have some neighbors that moved in across from us that are from Ohio. And when I told them this, I don't think they took it for the compliment that I thought it was. But I was like, oh, I just assumed you guys were from the South because y'all are so friendly, right? That's not to say that everybody from other states are not friendly, but in the South you wave at people. That's not normal, right? It's not normal in my experience of living in different parts of the United States. It's not normal that everybody waves at each other, that they talk to each other. As a matter of fact, I have neighbors that I finally have won over in my neighborhood, not anybody that's here, but the neighbors that I've won over in my neighborhood, because in the beginning, when we're walking the dog, me and Mary are out, and Mary's always getting on to me because I talk way too much, but as I'm walking through the neighborhood, if anybody's in the neighborhood, I'm like, hey, how are you doing? Love your yard. What's going on? We just start talking, and half the time neighbors are like, oh, he's coming again. Get inside, but I finally have won them over. They're used to me talking to them and stuff, and we're hitting it off wonderfully now. But what's a good neighbor? So today, that's what we're going to talk about, is being a good neighbor. We're going to actually talk about Good Samaritan. And we're going to talk about what it means to be a good neighbor. To do that, it's going to be easier to talk about other people first than it is to talk about ourselves. Right? Because the problem with being a good neighbor is all about love. That's what we're centered on, is love. That's what this whole series is about, is loving other people, demonstrating God's love. Now, I'm not going to spend every week setting up boundaries. I talked about that last week. There are boundaries with everyone. Doesn't matter. There will be people in your life that are toxic. There will be people in your life that are dangerous. There will be people in your life that you have to set boundaries up. That's our responsibility to know that, to set those boundaries up. But it is not, and should not, cannot be an excuse for not loving people. The responsibility is on us to place the boundaries. So in anything that I say today, maybe next week or whatever, understand I'm not talking about no boundaries in your life. Responsibility of boundaries are yours, but they're not an excuse and never should be. So we're talking about what a good neighbor is. We're talking about love. It's so much easier to talk about other people, right? Because here's the problem, and I want to address the problem from the perspective or from the viewpoint of the church. The problem with the church is that we see ourselves as loving people. We do. All across the board. We see ourselves as loving people, but we also see each other and we know we're not loving people. So I'm not going to talk about me because me, that's way too difficult. Let me talk about you. Let me talk about them. We're just going to use them. You know people like this, right? That are convinced that they're loving people. But there are so many people that don't make their cut. Right? They only want to be loving people around people that make their cut. That fit in, that are in the same stage of life with them, that look like them, sound like them, smell like them. They walk and quack like a duck, they're a duck, they fit in. If they don't fit a certain mold, they don't make the cut. And there's a million reasons why somebody wouldn't make the cut. Right? We have a million excuses. We have a million justifications of why somebody doesn't make the cut. But we all can see it in their lives. We can see their judgment. We can see how they are. They can't see it because they're convinced they're loving. But we can see it. And when we see the hypocrisy, we don't see it in our own lives, but we see it in their lives. And when we see it, other people see it, and people come into church, and they don't want to be a part of it because the world's full of that type of hypocrisy. Don't need it. It's not changing anything. We need our hearts examined, and we need to be real. We need to be real because now we're going to stop talking about them and understand that we're really going to be talking about us. We have to be real because the same things that we see in other people, they exist in us. Who's making the cut in your life? So we're going to talk about this parable that Jesus shared. In Luke 10, 25 through 28, it says, "And behold, a lawyer stood up to him." Let me start over. That's way ahead of my speech. "A lawyer stood up to put him to the test, saying, 'Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?' He said to him, 'What is written in the law? How do you read it?' And he answered, 'You shall love the Lord your God with your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself.' And he said to him, 'You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live.'" It's important that when we're reading the parable of the Good Samaritan that we start right here, because I want you to understand the context of the Good Samaritan. When we hear the Good Samaritan, when we hear just the words, the Good Samaritan, whether you've been in church all your life or haven't been in church at all, it probably resonates with you a little bit. There's a million hospitals that have the words Good Samaritan written across them. There's a Good Samaritan law in effect, that if you're helping someone out, there's laws to protect you as you're helping someone out. There's a Good Samaritan law. There's Good Samaritan written all over all kinds of establishments, nursing homes. There's the Samaritan purse. We've heard the Good Samaritan. Whether we've really dived into the parable or not, we've heard the Good Samaritan. We have an idea of what this is about. But I don't know if we really know what it's about, because I think the most of us would say the Good Samaritan is about helping other people. So I want us to understand the context of why Jesus shared the parable. Because every time that Jesus shares a parable, there's a theological punch that he puts behind what he's saying. There's something that each person that hears it, each listener that is exposed to the parable is supposed to search themselves. That's why the parable is shared. And it's no different right here. So the context is that this lawyer was seeking to trick Jesus Christ. And he comes up to Jesus and he says, "How do I earn eternal life?" Notice Jesus didn't answer his question because there's nothing that we can do in our own works or labor to earn eternal life. It is a gift from God. But the lawyer was trying to trick him. And so Jesus, instead of answering his question, asked him a question. Okay? He said, "What is written in the law? How do you read it, lawyer?" And the lawyer said, "Well, the greatest of the laws is, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, you are absolutely correct. Do this, and you will live. Notice that Jesus wasn't answering the question of how can you earn eternal life. Instead, he answered how you can experience eternal life, how you can experience life to the fullest. And that's in love, right? So when the lawyer answered this question, he's like, yes, if you do that, you will experience life. You will experience real life. If you can love God first and foremost, with all your heart and your mind and your soul, and you can love your neighbor as yourself, you will experience God to the fullest. And the lawyer realized that he was entrapped. He had said the right words, so he tried to change it up a little bit. Because he was like, oh, you have answered correctly, but you've got to do this. And the lawyer was entrapped with the neighbor part. Paul echoes this in Galatians 5:14, and it says, for the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And the lawyer's like, well, how do I do this? And so he asked the question of Jesus in Luke 10:29. He said, but he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Do you have the same questions? Like if I asked you who your neighbors are, can you name them? Are there people that live near you that you don't consider to be a neighbor? That, you would avoid at all costs if you saw them walking their dog, wanting to get into another conversation? They irritate you. They look a little dangerous. They have a lot of tattoos. They smoke. Do you have people that live near you, but you don't consider them to be your neighbor? Who's my neighbor? Is it about proximity? Do they have to live on the same block? Do they have to live in the same city? What is it? And so he's changing it up because the understanding would have been for a Jewish person that my neighbors would be a fellow Jew, right? They have to think like me. They have to have the same standards as I do. They have to have certain qualities. They have to make the cut to be my neighbor. But Jesus was ready for the question. And so he was explaining how to love your neighbor, loving your neighbor. In Luke 10:30, Jesus started with an answer of saying, and he replied, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. This old road from Jericho to Jerusalem, you can still experience this to this day, right? There's about an elevation difference between Jericho and Jerusalem of about 1,300 feet. It's a mountainous area. It's very hard terrain, rocky, boulders and stuff like that. Very hard to have a path through there at all. But now they have went through there because the Romans later kind of did their best to carve it out. And now they have like a paved road. But from what I understand, I haven't been down it, but from what I understand, that it takes a very experienced bus driver to take you that 17-mile trip down this mountain of hairpin turns, back and forth, and the roads are extremely narrow. Forget anything you've seen in the United States. This is a very dangerous path, right? And like a lot of people even want to walk this path. But back in Jesus' day, it was a horrible path, and they actually called this path the Bloody Way. But it was the only route between Jericho and Jerusalem. But because it was such a horrible path, robbers would set up there, and they were notorious for setting up on this path behind these boulders and stuff. And as you're taking all these curves and stuff like that, people that were traveling from Jericho to Jerusalem would routinely get mugged, harmed, murdered on this bloody way. And so Jesus starts his parable off with this. Now, as we're thinking about this, I want you to think about some horrible situations, right? Horrible situations that maybe you wouldn't want to step into, a place that you wouldn't want to step into. Maybe you shouldn't. There was years ago, I got a phone call. I'm not always, well, very rarely am I the sharpest tool in the drawer, right? Sometimes I just make decisions. But a few years ago, I got a phone call, and this lady was very distraught because her husband had been involved with drugs, and he had somehow or another, with the people that sold him the drugs, had given their only vehicle to the drug dealer for drugs. And she had children and so on and so forth, and she was distraught because it was her only means of providing for the family. And so, but she didn't want her husband to get in trouble. The right thing to do would be to get the husband in trouble. But I was like, oh, no problem. She said, I have an extra set of keys. I said, fantastic, we'll go get the car. That was stupid. That was stupid. So showed up at this very, very seedy part of town hotel, and there's just people, the whole hotel, I guess, is ran by this gang or whatever, and they're all looking out, and the minute I get there, I don't know what they were expecting. Maybe they just thought, well, we'll just see. Maybe this guy is going to buy drugs or whatever, but they're all watching me from like the balcony and stuff, and I'm walking towards the balcony, and as I walk up, I can see the car, but I don't want to know that I'm going to the car. So I get a couple feet away from the car, and I'm going to unlock it, jump in. All of a sudden, they're shouting. They're trying to run down from the balcony and leave, right? Stupid. Could have gotten hurt so many different ways. That's not unique to me, though. Guarantee you that every person in this room knows of a place, even in a beautiful place like St. Petersburg, that you just wouldn't go, especially at a certain time, right? A certain time of night or during whatever. But there's places you just wouldn't go. Am I right? It makes me feel better if there's at least one person that shakes their head, yes or no. Okay. So you know what I'm talking about, but sometimes we make decisions to do that, sometimes we don't. For whatever reason, this person had to travel this way. Maybe he had business in Jericho. Maybe we can imagine a lot of things, but maybe he had family there. Maybe it was his only means of livelihood. He had to travel the bloody way. Guaranteed that people that were traveling, if they had another choice, they wouldn't do it. Maybe they're just not the sharpest tool in the drawer like me, but they choose to do it. This guy's traveling down the bloody way. He runs into robbers. They beat him near half to death. They strip him of all his clothes and leave him in a ditch. Jesus says in Luke 10:31, now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him pass by on the other side. Right, a priest, a man of God. And it's very easy to think, okay, well now, if there's anybody that should care about other people, that should be all the way back in Leviticus. This is what the lawyer was citing, by the way, was the Great Commandment, right? But back in Leviticus, back in the Old Testament, from the very beginning, back in Moses' day, was given the Great Commandment of love God first, and then love your neighbor as yourself, right? All the way back. So a priest who knows the law back and forward, who represents God, there should be nobody else on the planet closer to God, absolutely should understand this commandment, this precedent of loving your neighbor. He walks by to the other side of the road. I mean, like, he doesn't even just walk by and check it out. Like, he's going to make sure that as far as he can get, because remember, these are narrow roads that just fall off a cliff. He goes as far as he can. The ditch would have been against the mountain. He's over here on the side like a billy goat. You know, like as far as I can over here on the cliff, because I want nothing to do with this. It's very easy, though, when we read this to have a little bit of judgment in our heart for the priest. But what could have been going on here? Because understand that the priest has duties too. In Leviticus, as well as the Great Commandment, there was also commandments about what priests were supposed to do. In Leviticus 21, there's a whole outline of what they are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. This guy, it says, was beaten half to death. Maybe when he saw the guy over in the ditch, he assumed that he was dead. Maybe if we're being very non-judgmental, maybe this priest had something that he had to go do, a ceremony that he had to go do, a sacrament that he had to commit. Maybe he was headed to the temple to serve. And in Leviticus 21, it says that a priest is not allowed to touch anything that is dead or dying, or he is unclean for 7 days, right? Maybe he assumed that this person was dead, or that he was dying, and he had to go do this right for God because he serves God. Maybe he just knew that he wasn't supposed to do that. Maybe he was put in a predicament. Maybe he was put in the predicament of having to decide between two different commands of whether I'm supposed to carry out what God has for me in my life as a priest and not touch this dying or dead thing so that I can serve in the manner I'm called, or I'm supposed to love my neighbor. Maybe that's what was going through his mind. You know, rabbis to this day, they have a rule that they go by that addresses this very predicament. And they call this rule heavier or lighter. Is it heavier or lighter? Is it heavier or lighter that I'm supposed to take the laws about my calling? Or is it heavier that I'm supposed to love my neighbor? Which one's heavier or lighter? And whichever one's heavier or lighter on the scale, I'm going to follow the heavier one. That's how they lived. Now, in this particular case, Jesus is going to show us that that's not what should have been on the scale. But possibly this is what the priest was doing. Don't know. We're using our imagination here. In Luke 10:32, it says, "So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side." Now, you might think, well, a Levite, doesn't that mean that he's a priest as well? Because aren't all the priests Levites? All the priests are from the Levites, but not all Levites are priests. So this Levite would have specifically, since he was laid out, would not have been a direct descendant of Aaron's, but he is a Levite, so he would have been used as an assistant probably to the priests. He would have had some capacity in the temple. He might have been a treasurer, he might have been a secretary or something like that. He would have served the priest, but he wasn't a priest. But it says the Levite, when he came by and saw him, he passed by on the other side as well. Just like a billy goat, he's out here on the edge of the cliff getting as far as he can from this person. Could be the same things. He definitely served in the temple, same as the priest. Could be same type of reasoning that was going through his mind. Maybe he had something to do. Maybe he was just busy. Maybe he was like us. Maybe he was like us. What would you do if you're riding home today, right? Be honest with yourself. What would you do today if you're riding home with your family or even by yourself, and you look over and you see somebody? You don't know them. You don't know them. They're stripped of most of their clothing. They're bleeding. They look like they're dead. Are you pulling the car over to the side to check on them? Or you're like, oh, no, that's the police's job. I'll just give them a call. You know, I'll go on down the road. Right? I'm not going to say this again. Understand that I believe in boundaries. But every parable is there with a theological punch to challenge your heart, not allow you to live in your excuses. What would you do? What would you do? I believe, and all of this is speculation, we don't know why the priest and the Levite would have went to the other side of the road. I believe that they might have been busy. They might have absolutely been weighing the heavier or lighter. But honestly, I believe they were scared. They were scared. I believe that when they saw that guy, they didn't know exactly what to do. And they probably had every reason to be scared. I'm pretty sure that it would have been a tactic of the robbers to at times have somebody look like they were in distress, and when you came to help them, that they would jump on you. I would have been afraid of that. That would have been one of my first thoughts if I saw somebody there, is like, well, who attacked them? And where are they at? Like that would have been my first thought. When they saw them, I'm positive that they were scared and they didn't want to get involved. And as they walked by this person and went to the other side of the road, all their thoughts and all their questions were about, if I do get involved, what will happen to me? What will happen to me? Instead of, if I don't get involved, what will happen to him? Jesus continues and says in Luke 10:33-37, but a Samaritan, boom, let's stop. First of all, this would have been like anything in our day. If anybody started off the conversation with, hey, there was a priest, a Levite, their next thought is an Israelite, a Jew, okay? For us, it would be like saying there was a lawyer and a doctor and a priest that walked into a bar, right? Like we would have had a common thought about what's going to happen, what's going to follow in this line. We're going in order here. So the priest, highest in order, to the Levite next, and then to just your ordinary Joe, right? To an ordinary Joe, an Israelite. But when Jesus said a Samaritan, that would have shook his listeners up. That changed everything. Why would you even throw that in there? There would have been no Jewish person hearing this that would have been like, whoa, where did that come from? A Samaritan. Because see, a Samaritan was the most hated, distrusted, despicable people that you can imagine to a Jew. They didn't honor anything that the Jews honored. They had the same bloodline, but they intermarried with other people. They served whatever god. They might equally serve Baal as they would Jehovah. They didn't care. They had just recently in history went into the temple and had disturbed all the bones in the temple. They didn't care. They were sacrilegious. They hated them and despised them in every way. They were them, but during the time of Daniel, they weren't led off by the Assyrians. They weren't taken into captivity, and they lived however they wanted to live. And the Jews despised them, hated them. Can you imagine that? Because I think that sometimes when we think about this story, we might think about somebody that's just like, oh, well, they disliked each other, or they, that was a despicable. That's like walking down the road and seeing somebody that's got a drug needle hanging out of their arms, and that's just kind of dirty, and I don't want to be around that. That's just a little dangerous and everything. No. Jesus is introducing us to two people that would despise each other. Okay? That would distrust each other on the biggest scale that you could possibly imagine. They would want nothing to do with each other. And so he says, but as a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. And he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. And then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, the lawyer, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. Man, listen to that last part right there. You go and do likewise. Man, that should be echoing in our minds. You go and do likewise. I want you to understand 2 things here. Loving your neighbor, because that's what Jesus is saying. The lawyer asked him a question at the beginning, how can I have eternal life, right? How can I have eternal life? And Jesus didn't say you can earn eternal life like this. He said you can experience it this way. You can experience life in this manner. You can experience real life in God by loving your neighbor. And the lawyer's like, okay, I got you. Well, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus tells him who his neighbor is. And he says, go and do likewise. How do we do that? First, we do it in acts of kindness. Absolutely. It's not solely about being an act of kindness, but it is about acts of kindness as well. So if you see yourself in this story as not the priest who passed by on the outer side, not the Levite who passed by on the outer side, but as the Samaritan who, when he saw a need, took the opportunity to express love. If you can see yourself in that role, then this is truly a story about finding the opportunities to express love in acts of kindness to people around us, right? And we're called to do that. Colossians 3:12 says, put on then as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. We're called to kindness. We are. As Christians that represent Christ, we're called to do things for other people. And there's definitely in this parable a call to arms. In this parable, there's a call for us to step up and look for opportunities of where we can pour love into the community through our actions. When's the last time that you saw an opportunity to do an act of kindness? Because they're around us in a million different ways. Matthew 7:12 says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. So I say to you that instead of the priest and the Levite who walk to the side and says, what's going to happen to me if I get involved? Reverse that question and say, if I don't stop, what's going to happen to this man? If not me, then who? What's going to happen to this person? Now, not everybody's sitting in a ditch half dead, but everybody faces death. Not everybody's beaten up by robbers, but everybody faces circumstances that break us. And if you don't think in all those people's lives that we have contact with, if you don't think that in all those opportunities that not once that God's wanting to use you, there's something broken with your reasoning. We're called to love others through our actions. But also, here's a little theological punch. Maybe Jesus is not wanting us to see the parable from the viewpoint of being the Samaritan. Maybe he wants us to see it from the viewpoint of being the victim in the ditch. Because loving your neighbor is about accepting your neighbor. Do you see your neighbor? Do you know who your neighbors are? Think about the person that's sitting in the ditch, that victim that's half beaten. Think about him as he watches the priest go by. Yeah, you would want to make excuses, right? I would, even if I was hurting. I'd be like, well, he's a priest. He's serving God. He's probably going to something. I completely understand how busy his life is. I completely understand that this looks shady, and I probably wouldn't stop for somebody that was bleeding on the side of the road because this could be a trick. This could be very dangerous. I get it. Just let me die. Then a Levite comes by, and you're like, whoa, my fellow Israelite. Dang, he didn't stop either. All right, I reckon it's my lot in life to bleed out right here. And then all of a sudden somebody's coming down the road and you see them coming down the road and you're like, is that I bet he goes to the side of the road. Them Samaritans, them dirty, non-trustworthy, horrible. Why is he walking over here? Don't you touch me. You know, like, don't you, I'd rather die. I'd just rather die right now. I'd rather die than you touch me. I hate you. I despise you that much. And then this person takes you, the one person you're not expecting, takes you, cares for you, puts you on his own animal, gives you the money, the food, and everything that you need to recoup. This person that you despise, is he your neighbor? Matthew 5:44 says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law of the prophets, right? But Luke 6:35 says, but love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be the sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and to the evil. So who is my neighbor? How do I define the parameters of who my neighbor is? If it falls even within the category of my enemies. Who in your life would fit that bill? Who fits that bill? Who do you despise? We unfortunately are so broken now that we despise people. Hypocrisy is in our lives on so many different levels. And I'm going to call out some people. I'm going to call out people in this very room that are my very friends, and hopefully they'll forgive me. I'm not calling you out by names, but if I stomp on your feet, know that I'm stomping on mine too. But in our levels of who makes the cut and who doesn't make the cut, we can see it in every different way. Even as we went through this pandemic, right? This pandemic, I was thinking about how funny we are about certain things. But as we went through this pandemic, I have noticed that as the months and the now it seems like years have gone by. I guess it has. It's almost been, I can almost say years with the plural. But we gather together. We're starting to gather together again, right? And it's funny, as I go over to different people's houses, that as I walk in, somehow or another, because I'm Danny Lewis, because I'm a pastor, because I'm a friend, I don't know what the reasoning is, but if I'm in a certain gathering, there could be a dozen of us that get together and we're not wearing masks. But if you go and take that same person and they go to another group of people that they don't make the cut as much, and it's just a dozen of them, they got masks on. Do you think that I have superpowers to keep off this invisible little bug, this virus? Do you think that somehow I've done something that the other 12 haven't done? No, you do that because you trust me. Why do you trust me? I don't know. I know nothing about COVID. I have absolutely no idea. I may be carrying it right now. I have no clue. Okay, don't know. You know what I'm saying? Why do we have certain standards in people's lives that we don't have with other people? Because we trust people differently. Right? Some people make the cut, some people don't make the cut. And I ain't, not just on that simple level, but that's just an example of where we do it, but we do it in all forms of our life. And Jesus said that when it comes to loving, that we have to look at our own hearts. We have to redefine who makes the cut. Who's our neighbor? And as we're going through this parable, I want you to understand that Jesus was not only wanting us to think about who our neighbor was or is, but also what type of neighbor am I? Am I a good neighbor? This morning, are you a good neighbor? Do you challenge yourself in how you see other people? Do you challenge yourself to look for opportunities in other people's lives? It's not a call to spend your entire life out there on the bloody way. but it's a call not to avoid the bloody way so that you can be what you want to be. Does that make sense? This morning, are you a good neighbor? Let's stand. This morning, maybe there's some things in your life that you'd like to give over to Christ. Maybe there's something that's pricked your conscience this morning, and it's like, those are areas in my life that I need to turn over to God. This is your opportunity.